Matthias Sundin says that humanity is facing its greatest change ever. According to Tony Seba, some call him naive, many call him a foolish optimist. But Seba has repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, proven to be right. And his critics have proven themselves to be wrong. We should be listening. I'm sure I've already mentioned it, but the biggest reason for this YouTube channel, for me starting a YouTube channel, was Tony Seba. Tony Seba was laughed at. He was mocked. People derided him. People said he was a ridiculous optimist who had no idea what he was talking about.
And this is a compendium of several of my books over the last 10 years, 15 years, and some analyses. And essentially the summary is that disruptions are happening in all levels, all around the world, all at once. The next 15, 20 years are going to be the most disruptive in history, bar none. And it's not just disruption. It's what I call phase change disruption. So in my book, Clean Disruption of 2014, I basically published this exact slide where I said, over the following 15 years, here's the cost curve of lithium-ion batteries. And, at the time, folks called me insane. You, Tony Seba, are insane, right? $100 per kilowatt hour by 2023. Really? Well, here we are. And it just crossed $100 per kilowatt hour. Just on the money. But the point is not to be right on the money to the month. The point is more or less to anticipate the disruption. It doesn't take a genius because cost curves are like gravity. They're like gravity. It will happen.
However, what he predicted proved to be correct and everyone else was wrong. And he made that initial prediction in 2010. Well, now he's made new predictions based on Wright's law. His predictions are being considered ridiculous. His new book has been derided by many. Many are saying he's just too optimistic once again. But considering I personally believe he got it right and everyone else got it wrong, I think we should be paying attention. We should be paying a hell of a lot more attention about what he's saying than what we actually are. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the channel. I'm Sam Evans. You're watching The Electric Viking. Great to see you. Matthias Sundin said this. Mention Tony Seba at X and watch many on energy Twitter go ballistic. A lot of people hate him. It's insane. Completely off the wall. He understands nothing about energy. Incredibly naive is what they say. I've heard this before. People say this about me all the time. The reason for the anger is that he comes with extreme predictions relative to what everyone else believes. The beauty of historical predictions is that you can check how they turned out. We can now see what Tony Seba's main prediction was and whether or not he was right, or whether or not all the pessimists were right. In his book, Solar Trillions, Tony Seba wrote the price of a kilowatt hour of solar electricity would be 4 to 5 cents in 2020, when the price was sitting at 30 cents when he made the prediction.
Right? I predicted it. I said PV was going to drop by 80 to 90% in the 2010s. Boom, right? Cost curves, gravity. So it happened as predicted. And today in many countries, including the US, in the US, 92% of projects waiting to be interconnected to the grid are solar or wind. And 99% of storage is batteries, right? Here's the convergence. It's happening.
He was saying the price would go from 30 cents to 4 to 5 cents in only 10 years. The International Energy Agency, or the IEA, believed it would stay about the same. Even other so-called naive optimists like Ramez Nan, who believed in a halving between 2010 to 2020, in other words, a price of around 15 cents, turned out to be too pessimistic for what would really happen. Now, for the price to do what it did, for Tony Seba's prediction to be correct. It meant that the price of electricity had to fall by 90% in only 10 years. Just because he's been right historically, it doesn't mean that Tony Seba is now right in his newest predictions. Now, of course, prices fell by 93%, so he was right. However, people are now saying his newest predictions are just crazy.
You don't need seasonal storage. You don't need hydrogen. You only need 1, 2, 3, 5 days of battery storage. And it's a phase change transformation into a new system. And essentially, it's non-linear. So why does it work? Well, what we found when we studied this was a new property which we call the clean energy U-curve, which says you can essentially trade off storage and generation. So the more generation you have, the less storage you need. It's not intuitive, but we found that. But it's along a U-curve, right? So if you design the system for the bottom of the U, derivative is equal to 0, then you get massive amounts of power, 2, 3, 4, 5 times more power the rest of the year, which we call superpower.
That said, he doesn't pluck his predictions out of thin air. They are built on Wright's law and other rules that we have used to actually work out what the future holds. And it's significant. We should be paying attention. In a new talk, Tony Seba has made a series of new predictions.
And if you look at the Chinese auto market, the largest in the world, September, new energy vehicles, which is electric plus plug-in hybrids, were 39% of new vehicles, up from like 2% 5 years ago, right? So it's happening very quickly. And some folks, even in the industry, are saying that it might be 80% by 2025, not just 2030. Again, my crazy prediction from 2014 was that by 2030 it's over, right? And so why? Because by 2030, there's going to be $5,000. So that car is probably going to cost $5,000. So for purely economic reasons, by 2030, transportation in competitive markets is pretty much over for combustion engines.
One more extreme than another. This happened at a conference in Saudi Arabia in front of a bunch of oil barons and oil sheiks. This is what makes it all the more scary. He was essentially issuing them a threat. He was telling them what would happen. And the crazy thing is, they're actually listening to him. They're now changing their economies in many places in the Middle East to be more dependent on renewable energy and moving away from oil. Here's what Tony said. The great transformation is happening. The big changes happen when several new technologies converge. Several technologies are converging right now, which will lead to huge structural changes over the next 20 years. And if you want to benefit from those, you kind of need to know what they are, right? If you want to invest in the right technology, you need to have an idea of what's happening. Think of this as a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. A butterfly is not a flying caterpillar. It's something completely different. We are at the beginning of this kind of change in society right now. Changes occur in S-curves. Now, whilst hearing this information from Tony, the oil sheiks basically nodded confidently, sipping water and eating some expensive delicacies. But whilst it may appear as though they didn't pay attention, I believe they are. The world's biggest renewable energy city is currently being built in Dubai. So what's changing? Transportation, says Tony. An electric car with a range of at least 300 kilometers or 200 miles will cost $5,000 in 2030. He doesn't say in which country, by the way, this is, but he says it will cost $5,000. Now
So again, in that same book, Clean Disruption, I published this other cost curve for electric vehicles with 200 mile, 300 plus kilometer range. And again, at the time, there was only Tesla, the Model S, which was $80,000 or $100,000, right? And the idea I mean, I said that by 2023, by now, there would be $15,000 electric vehicles with 300-kilometer range. No subsidy, right? I mean, the market would bring them. And that was considered insane at the time. And I also said that by 2025, it would get down to about 11,500. Inconceivable, right? Again, it sounded insane. And, you know, I went to the Shanghai Auto Show in April. The BYD Seagull is $11,400, right? And if you look at the Chinese auto market, the largest in the world, September, new energy vehicles, which is electric plus plug-in hybrids, were 39% of new vehicles, up from like 2% 5 years ago, right? So it's happening very quickly. And some folks, even in the industry, are saying that it might be 80% by 2025, not just 2030. Again, my crazy prediction from 2014 was that by 2030 it's over, right? And so why? Because by 2030, there's going to be $5,000. So that car is probably going to cost $5,000. So for purely economic reasons, by 2030, you know, transportation in competitive markets, it's pretty much over for combustion engines.
Now he's referring, of course, to a small car, say something like a Nissan Micra, a small car. This prediction is actually not that extreme. Realistically, there's already cars in China that cost that amount now, $5,000. There's already cars that cost that much in China. So how long will it take for us to get those cars from China? That's the question. Tony's saying, well, 6 years from now, we'll have those EVs at the current prices China is paying for them. That doesn't seem all that outlandish if you ask me. He says it's then over for fossil fuel cars with combustion engines. 2030, that's it. Basically, that's the end. And I think I agree. Tony's right on this. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but 2030 is the year that it's just finished for internal combustion. But that's not the biggest change to transportation. The biggest change is electric autonomous taxis, or transport as a service. Transport as a service will cost 1/10 per kilometer of what it costs to own and operate your own car, which is really saying something, because if you can get a small car that can do 200 miles of range for $5,000, the cost of ownership is extremely low. If the cost to actually use some sort of transport as a service, that may be that could be a van, that could be a car, it could be any type of vehicle, whatever suits your needs. But if it's 1/10 of the cost of ownership, it's very, very cheap. The total cost per kilometer or per mile will be lower than the cost of gasoline. The simple only, just the cost of burning that gasoline.
But that is not the disruption, really. The big phase change disruption is actually the convergence of autonomous, electric, and on-demand transportation. Think Uber, Didi, robotaxi, right? Owned, managed by fleets. So essentially, you know that there are already autonomous vehicles level 4, pretty much in many countries by now. I mean, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, says that it's improving at the rate of about 1 million times over the next 10 years. It's going to be on a per kilometer basis, 1/10 of the cost of owning a car, any car. 1/10. 10x has always enabled disruptions and quick disruptions, always, every single time in history. So, you know, TaaS is going to be so cheap, it's going to be 4 times cheaper than the operating cost of a combustion engine car. 4 times cheaper than just the operating costs, right? It's going to be so cheap that the cost per kilometer is going to be cheaper than just the cost of gasoline. What do you think is going to happen, right? So I see that by 2030, most miles will be electric in one form or another.
Now, when Tony said this, apparently the oil sheiks looked scared and unsure of themselves. They didn't like this part of the talk very much. Energy. What's going to change in energy? Solar power is the cheapest energy source ever. That's already happened. We've already seen the cost per kilowatt hour come down to 2 cents. In fact, recent tenders have been about 1.9 cents. The cost of solar energy, he says, will decrease by another 70% over the next 10 years. Now, this is pretty crazy out there kind of stuff, guys, because the cost of solar panels this year has already come down by 30% versus what it was at last year. Lithium-ion batteries will decrease by 80% in cost over the next 10 years. 80% from today. The cost today is already historically low. The cost of batteries today, it's already around 35% less than what it was sitting at 12 months ago. Anyway, I'm excited. A 100% solar wind battery energy system is possible.
You don't need seasonal storage. You don't need hydrogen. You only need 1, 2, 3, 5 days of battery storage. And it's a phase change transformation into a new system. And essentially, it's non-linear. So why does it work? Well, what we found when we studied this was a new property which we call the clean energy U-curve, which says you can essentially trade off storage and generation. So the more generation you have, the less storage you need. It's not intuitive, but we found that. But it's along a U-curve, right? So if you design the system for the bottom of the U, derivative is equal to 0, then you get massive amounts of power, 2, 3, 4, 5 times more power the rest of the year, which we call superpower.
And this is not really a drastic prediction because it is. We've already seen this. One of the biggest cities in Australia called Adelaide or South Australia, it's already running basically as just solar, wind and battery storage, and it does work. Now, Tony says one thing which a lot of people don't agree with. You don't need seasonal energy storage. Just less than a week's energy reserves in batteries are enough. And well, you get that from an EV battery alone. The system is designed for the time of year when it's darkest and you get the least solar energy, which means that for the rest of the year, you have a surplus of cheap electricity. So you design your system or you buy your EV and your backup battery and your solar to be enough for basically the worst sun period of the year. Now you do get sun, remember, even when it's cloudy, but it's factoring that in. All right, here's the predictions on food and agriculture. Precision fermentation is a technology for producing food ingredients like proteins, fats, and vitamins. The cost of precision protein fermentation has gone from $1 million per kilo to $100 per kilo in the past 20 years. So what does that mean? It means by 2030, the cost will be $1 to $2 per kilo. So precision fermentation is the food of the future, and it will feed the planet. So basically what Tony is saying. Animal protein costs $10 per kilo today. In fact, it's probably closer to $20 per kilo, depending on where you live. The cost of precision fermented protein will reach that price by 2025. So in just over a year from now, it will be as cheap to buy precision fermented protein, which is, obviously much more humane. This is growing protein in a laboratory, essentially, which can in fact be healthier.
So let me talk quickly about the disruption of the cow and specifically about the disruption of milk. Why milk? Because milk is 3% protein. The thing that makes milk are two proteins called casein and whey, but that's only 3% of dairy, right? Because animal proteins sell for about $10 in wholesale markets. So casein and whey and so on, $10. If my numbers are right, the industry is going to reach that in 2025. Only 2 years away, actually a year and a half from now, right? So that's when the collapse of the dairy industry starts.
This will, among other things, lead to the disruption of the cow, where we need 1/5 of the energy, 1/10 of the water, and 100th of the land area to produce milk. 2.7 billion hectares of farmland will not be needed for agriculture. 2.7 billion hectares of farmland won't be needed for agriculture by 2040. That's as big as the USA, China, and Australia put together. That's not going to be needed anymore for agriculture. How does this impact society? Well, Tony says these three changes mean a 90% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035. In other words, Tony's saying, you know what? We're all freaking out about global warming and it's very real. But by 2035, we will have reduced emissions by 90%. Sounds very, very optimistic. I hope he's right. But he's been right before. Transportation, energy, and food will be abundant, and there will be a thing called superabundance. There'll be more than we need. Those who understand this will be the big winners in the greatest change in human history. It will lead to a new era of freedom.
And here's the key. Everything we know about economics is about to change. Because if you follow the cost curves for energy and also the phase change disruptions, transportation, and food, it's all going to superabundance and near zero cost. If you've looked at ChatGPT, you know where AI is going. Essentially, superabundant intelligence, and the cost of intelligence is going to zero. And the same thing is going to happen with labor. Are we ready for a world in which intelligence, labor, energy, transport, and food are actually asymptotically getting to zero? Because those of you who get that, right, and plan over the next 15, 20 years, will actually be the ones to win in the great transformation of humanity.
Now, is all this possible? When you think about it, I think it is. Because artificial intelligence, AGI, may be close. Bots, the Tesla bot or other bots made by other companies, in combination with robo-taxis, in combination with much of the technology that we've seen that's just emerging, it may all converge at once, as Tony predicts. Now, some of Tony's predictions sound insane. They sounded equally insane in 2010, but he got it right. Maybe we should be paying attention. Let me know what you think about Tony Seba's predictions in the comments below. Personally, I do think he's being optimistic. I genuinely do. But, hey, let's face the facts here. Tony Seba is probably a lot smarter than pretty much everyone else living on the planet. Thank you for watching.